Dharma desert bloom with the water of his compassion. And the West then, as you already heard from Madalena and Stella, was truly a Dharma desert. There were no fully ordained monks teaching Buddhism to Westerners or teaching Westerners how to meditate or how to do any other Buddhist practices. At that time, there were very, very few Buddhist sutras that were translated to English, and the ones that were not widely available. I met the Venerable Master for the first time, I think it was on December 31st, 1965. I had come to San Francisco after graduating from college to study Chinese and to learn how to meditate. At that time, Shifu had moved from Chinatown, and he was living in a slum, in a flat, in the Fillmore district in San Francisco at the corner of Webster Street and Sutter Street. At that time, he was lecturing on the Lotus Sutra 2 or 3 evenings a week, and he also gave another lecture on Sunday when some of his very devout Chinese disciples would come. Most evenings when he was lecturing, no Chinese people showed up, and often just a handful of Americans, and Shifu usually had no one to translate for him. Indeed, I think that he probably continued lecturing even when there was no people there anyway. I would often go to listen to him lecture, even though I couldn't understand what he was saying because my Chinese was very rudimentary at that time. But I wanted to listen to the sound of his voice speaking the Dharma. And I would like to remind you that the living, sentient sound of the Dharma is very, very different than a recording. A couple of years later, after I'd studied more Chinese, I started helping to translate for him myself. Later on, he got a lot of invitations to speak in various places, including universities, and he always brought with him monastic and lay disciples and had them speak first so they could learn how to speak the Dharma, and only after they had all spoken would he speak. The master would ask them to share what was in their hearts from their study of the Dharma, and if they had been there for one day even, he would ask them to speak and explain what they had learned in one day. As I said, I first drew near to Shifu because I wanted to learn how to meditate, and I started doing that almost as soon as I met him. At that time, in this slum building, he used to sit every evening from 7 to 8 for open meditation. In other words, he opened his door, and anybody who wanted to come in off the street and sit with him was welcome to do so. Later on, as you may have noticed in one of the slides, I asked him whether I could go to meditate at when he had moved back to San Francisco at Tianhongmiao, and I spent a couple of weeks meditating with him a lot. Then that was in December of 1967, over my winter break. My first formal Chan session with him was during the spring break of 1968. A lot of you already know that story. A number of us students in Seattle wrote him a letter and asked him to come to Seattle to preside over a 7-day meditation session in Seattle. And he had one of his early American disciples, Nancy Lovett, write a letter to us. He dictated a letter to her in which he said he couldn't come to Seattle because if he came to Seattle there would be a major earthquake in San Francisco, so we should all come to San Francisco to have the meditation session. So, since we all came down to San Francisco, and since we were all beginners in meditation, we sat from about 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. and we had our sessions, our sits interspersed with 20-minute walking sessions and with lots of breaks for instruction by the Venerable Master, who would tell all kinds of wonderful stories to both entertain us and illuminate the principles of the Dharma. We needed a lot of attention and encouragement. Shifu oversaw most of the cooking and sat almost every sit with us and gave us a lot of pep talks, telling everybody that they should try their best, and that if we did try our best, everyone who was there would have some sort of awakening. If we didn't have a great awakening, then we would have a small awakening. One day, after most of the session was over and everybody was still sitting on their cushions after one of the sits, he had everybody talk about what they had experienced and learned in the session and cautioned everybody not to talk from their head, koto-chan, but to talk from their heart about what was true about what they had learned. And I remember I was sitting next to Shifu, and we went all the way around the room, and when it finally was my turn to speak, I was a little apprehensive. So I looked inside for something to say, and right then there was a small earthquake. And I don't remember clearly what I said. I probably said something about not being attached because there's nothing really solid to hang on to. But I do remember at that time, Shifu looked over at me and smiled. I was fortunate to have studied some Chinese at the university at that time and also in Taiwan before the summer Shurangama session of 1968, when many young people came and studied Buddhism with them, and that was really the beginning of the Dharma Realm Buddhist Association as we know it today. I want to point out to you that most of the people at the summer session didn't know any Chinese, and many of them, in addition to the daily schedule of intensive Chan sitting, studying the sutra, listening to 2 or more sutras a day, memorizing the Great Compassion Mantra, memorizing the Shurangama Mantra, in addition to all that, many of them, through their own volition, also started using the Chinese English dictionaries and looking up the characters in the sutra one by one so that they could begin to learn Chinese for themselves. And so from the very beginning, they very, very vigorously studied Chinese, mostly on their own, at the Master's feet. And then, because when there was nobody else to do it, these are the people who started translating the sutras into English. 4 of the first 5 Americans to go forth from the home life learned their Chinese that way. These were the people who Shifu encouraged to start the Buddhist Text Translation Society and encouraged to begin translating the sutras into English. There was no one else to do it, and what they were able to do, I think, was truly remarkable. And I think we should all give thanks to those people for their courageous pioneering efforts. Amitabha.